The Pacific sky was glowing orange long before sunrise on June 19, 1944. The date American pilots would later call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But for one Japanese aviator, it would become something far stranger. Something the men on both sides would remember with disbelief. 22-year-old Petty Officer First Class Masaru Yasukawa stood on the flight deck of the carrier Shokaku, gripping his Type 0 Model 52 Fighter as deck crews scrambled around him. Smoke drifted across the deck from burning anti-aircraft batteries. Engines roared. Pilots shouted over the chaos. The entire Imperial Japanese Navy was bracing for the largest carrier battle of the war. Yasukawa adjusted his harness and slid into the cockpit, heart hammering against his ribs. He wasn't the most experienced pilot in his unit, not by a long shot, but he was precise, fearless, and worst of all for his enemies. He had nothing left to lose. His younger brother had been shot down 2 months earlier. His squadron was down to half strength, and the Shokaku had taken a torpedo hit before dawn. If the Americans attacked again, the ship might not survive the morning. Yasukawa, his flight leader, shouted over the deck sirens. "You will break left and intercept any bombers that slip through our first wave. Do not let them reach the fleet." "Understood." He saluted sharply. "Hi." Minutes later, his Zero's engine screamed to life. Smooth, strong, familiar. He took off into a sky already speckled with distant contrails, climbing through hot, rising air shaped by the fire and steel of the opening strikes. At 15,000 feet, he spotted them. 4 American B-24 Liberators, hulking silver bombers, lumbering toward what remained of the Japanese carrier group. Their formation was tight. Their gunners were alert. Their payloads would finish what the torpedo had started. Yasukawa tightened his grip on the stick. He dove. Tracer fire erupted around him. His canopy vibrated, but he pushed harder, engine wailing at full throttle. Then, a violent jolt. A burst of .50 caliber fire ripped into his right wing. Flames blossomed instantly, licking across the fuselage. His gauges flickered. His controls stiffened. Any rational pilot would have bailed out. Any sane man would have pulled away from the inferno spreading along the skin of his aircraft. But Masaru Yasukawa was not most pilots. He steadied the burning Zero, smoke filling the cockpit, heat searing his right arm, and pointed it directly at the first bomber. Because he wasn't done. Not yet. Not until the bombers fell. Or he did. What happened next would stun American air crews, electrify Japanese officers, and become one of the most unbelievable combat feats of the Pacific War. A burning Zero, spiraling, smoking, half out of control, would down 4 bombers in the next 3 minutes. At 14,800 feet, Masaru Yasukawa fought the instinct to recoil as fire crawled along his wing like a living creature. The right tip of the Zero snapped and fluttered, fabric peeling away in the slipstream. The cockpit filled with the sickening smell of burning lacquer and aviation fuel. Heat radiated through the aluminum skin, blistering the paint and beginning to blister Yasukawa's own arm. He gritted his teeth. Not yet. Keep flying, not yet. Ahead of him, the 4B-24 Liberators held course. Huge, steady, and indifferent to the lone fighter streaking toward them. Their defensive guns sparkled with bright strobes as .50 caliber rounds carved through the sky. A sane pilot would break off, level out, bail out, but the flaming shape of his Zero didn't falter. If anything, the burning wing made him faster, the airflow ripping pieces off the aircraft and reducing drag in unpredictable ways. Smoke spiraled behind him in long black ribbons, marking his path like a comet falling through battle. The tail gunner of the lead B-24 saw him first. "One coming in, he's on fire," but even shouted. The warning reached the cockpit too late. Yasukawa was already lining up the shot. He throttled, full forward. The engine howled. The vibration grew violent enough to blur the controls. He squeezed the trigger. Twin 20mm cannons spat fire, the tracers streaking upward, punching directly into the Liberator's belly. The bomber lurched, its wings rolling unevenly. A plume of smoke burst from the right engine. Yasukawa didn't wait to see the result. He dove under the bomber's shadow as the wounded B-24 dropped altitude, bleeding fire and fuel. One down, but he had no time to celebrate. The next bomber opened up with every gun in range. Side gunners, belly turret, top turret. A storm of .50 caliber fire filling the sky like a swarm of angry hornets. Rounds cracked past his canopy. A shell tore through his left aileron. Another punched a hole in the fuselage inches behind his head. The fire on his wing intensified. Molten droplets of burning metal and lacquer streaked off the surface, trailing behind like sparks off a grinding wheel. His cockpit temperature climbed to unbearable levels. Smoke stung his eyes until everything blurred. Yet the Zero held, barely. Yasukawa tilted into a climbing spiral, using what little control he had left to slip beneath the bomber's firing arc. He could feel the aircraft resisting, sluggish, unbalanced. The flames' heat pulsed through his gloves, through the stick, through the very bones of the aircraft. But he knew this maneuver. He had practiced countless times in clean air. This was muscle memory, flying on instinct. He pulled the nose up until the bomber's underside filled his sights. "Yamate!" a gunner screamed as he saw the burning fighter rising toward him. Yasukawa fired. The burst tore directly into the B-24's bomb bay. A blinding flash exploded from the bomber's midsection, followed by a chain reaction as fuel and ordnance ignited. The bomber disintegrated in a fiery burst, fragments raining downward in a burning arc across the sky. 2. But the explosion rocked Yasukawa's Zero so violently that he nearly blacked out. Shrapnel peppered his already damaged wing. A piece of bomber debris smashed into his cowling, crushing part of the engine intake. The Zero sputtered, coughed, nearly stalled. Yasukawa slammed the throttle and coaxed the machine back from the edge of death. His vision swam. The cockpit smoke burned his lungs. The fire had nearly reached the wing root. Still, he pulled his battered aircraft into a shallow climb. 2 B-24s remained. They were already turning away, frightened by the insane, burning fighter tearing through their formation. Their gunners sprayed blind burst behind them. Panic, overriding discipline. Yasukawa leveled out, each breath ragged and metallic. "I am not done." He wiped his eyes with a shaking glove. The world cleared just enough for him to see the nearest bomber banking left, trying to escape the madman blazing behind it. He pushed the dying Zero into pursuit. It shuddered. It groaned. It left a trail of oily black smoke. But it followed his will, as long as the engine turned, as long as the controls responded, as long as his strength held. Masaru Yasukawa would not let those bombers reach the fleet. The burning Zero clawed upward through turbulent air, every vibration threatening to rip the wings clean off. Yasukawa coughed hard, black smoke filling his lungs, stinging his throat. The right side of his flight suit smoldered where heat from the wing seeped inward. His goggles were fogged with soot. His vision tunneled into a narrow, shaking circle. But the bomber ahead of him, the third B-24, was still in range. Its engine strained at full power as it tried to outclimb it, silver skin flashing in the harsh Pacific sunlight. The top turret rotated to face him. The gunner inside, hands shaking, opened fire. TRR! TRR! A string of .50 cal tracers slashed across the air and stitched through the Zero's rear fuselage. Yasukawa felt the plane shudder violently as rounds punched through the tail. The nose pitched downward for a moment, just long enough for the wing fire to flare brighter, feeding on the sudden rush of oxygen. The bomber's gunner screamed into his intercom. "I'm hitting him, he's still coming." Yasukawa tightened his grip, struggling against the stick's increasing stiffness. He whispered through clenched teeth, "Fly, fly, fly." The Zero steadied, more a result of stubborn than aerodynamics, and continued its climb. Because Yasukawa wasn't using finesse anymore. He was using momentum, a momentum created by fire, fear, and fury. The mid-air duel, the B-24 leveled out near 16,000 feet. Yasukawa climbed right after it, barely. The Zero's engine coughing like a dying animal. He closed to within 150 yards, close enough to see the tail gunner's terrified face, close enough to see the bomber shaking from the strain of evasion. The bomber pitched sharply right, beginning a defensive turn. Yasukawa rolled left, a dangerous gamble. The burning wing nearly refused the maneuver. but momentum carried him through the roll, sparks streaming from the wingtip. The Zero slipped across the bomber's blind spot. The tail turret swiveled desperately, but too late. Yasukawa's cannons roared. 2 bursts, straight into the right side wing root of the bomber. The engine exploded in a rolling fireball, ripping the wing open like peeled metal. Flames streamed behind it as the bomber dropped altitude, spiraling into a steep descent. The surviving American crew members bailed out, tiny figures leaping into the cold air. 3. But the blast washed over Yasukawa's fighter, jolting it sideways. Smoke swallowed the cockpit. Flames licked the canopy frame. His skin prickled with heat as the Zero's temperature skyrocketed. He closed his eyes just for half a second. When he opened them again, the final B-24 loomed ahead, its nose angled downward, its engines thundering, its gunners firing wildly in every direction. And it was heading straight for the Japanese fleet. The final chase. Yasukawa had seconds, maybe less, before the bomber reached a safe glide range over the target area. He coughed violently as black smoke poured into his lungs. His hands slipped on the stick from sweat and soot. His right arm burned hot from radiant heat. But the Zero still had power, still had bite, still had fight. He pushed the throttle forward. The fighter lurched, coughing and sputtering. Flames along the wing intensified, now flowing backward in a long, whipping tail of fire. He wasn't chasing the bomber anymore. He was diving at it, using gravity to force one last attack. The tail gunner's eyes widened. He hammered the trigger, spraying a desperate stream of tracers that carved directly through Yasukawa's cowling, tearing into the engine block. Metal shards flew. Oil splattered across the canopy. The engine spat sparks like a dying torch. But Yasukawa didn't pull away. He leaned into the dive. The Zero screamed downward like a meteor. Heat built around him until the cockpit felt like an oven. Fire surged across the windshield edges, filling his vision with hellish orange light. At 300 yards, Yasukawa fired. Not a careful burst, not a measured shot. A full, desperate final barrage. His cannons thundered. Tracer lines stitched across the sky. Rounds punched into the bomber's left fuselage and shredded the tail assembly. The B-24 wobbled. Its left stabilizer tore away. The bomber rolled sharply, losing altitude fast. Yasukawa locked onto it again. His eyes stung. His lungs burned. His fighter groaned like it was moments from falling apart. At 200 yards, he fired again. This time the rounds tore into the cockpit. Glass shattered. The nose dipped. The bomber entered a fatal spin. It dropped like a stone, down, 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 until it vanished through a cloud layer below. 4. Yasukawa had done it. A burning fighter, a dying engine, an impossible mission. And yet, the Zero was not finished falling. Because now, with the battle won, the fire had finally reached the fuel line. A deep thud shuddered through the aircraft. Flames surged along the cowling. The engine seized. The Zero entered a slow, spiraling descent toward the sea. Yasukawa's strength ebbed. His vision darkened. The cockpit filled with smoke. But he was still conscious enough to hear the astonished radio calls from the American formation he had just torn apart. The fire didn't stop him. That Zero shot down 4 bombers. 4? He's going down now, God Almighty. Yasukawa reached for the canopy latch. His fingers shook. The world spun. Below, the Pacific waited. And so did fate. The Zero's cockpit was now an inferno of heat, smoke, and blistering metal. Yasukawa's hair crackled at the edges, sweat boiled instantly off his skin, and every breath came as a jagged, burning gasp. The canopy glass was smeared with soot and streaks of oil, turning the world outside into a warped swirl of orange and blue. The aircraft shook violently. Less flight, more controlled fall. He reached again for the canopy latch. It burned his glove. He gritted his teeth, forced his hand around the blistering metal, and yanked. The latch snapped open with a harsh metallic crack, just as the fuel line beneath the cowling ignited in a sudden whoosh, sending a torch of flame over the forward fuselage. The canopy blasted off in a slipstream. Freezing wind slammed into Yasukawa, mixing with the furnace heat in a shocking, violent clash. It cleared the smoke just enough for him to see the churning Pacific below, glittering silver between streaks of flame. The Zero spun again, a slow, nauseating roll. He slumped sideways in the cockpit, barely holding on to consciousness. His vision pulsed red and black. A ringing hum filled his ears. His fingers felt numb, burned, battered, slipping. He had downed for bombers, but he would never live to report it. Never see the deck crew again. Never send a final letter home. At least, the fleet is safe. He closed his eyes, but the Zero wasn't done, because something else, something unexpected, began happening in the sky above him. The American fighters arrive. Two F-6F Hellcats swept down from higher altitude, drawn by the enormous columns of smoke rising from the burning bomber wrecks below. Their pilots, veterans of countless dogfights, knew the signature shape of a falling Zero. But this one was different. It was on fire, not lightly damaged, but engulfed. And yet, one of the Hellcat pilots shouted into his radio, "Jesus, that Zero is still trying to control the fall. He's fighting it. Look, look." The burning fighter's control surfaces flexed weakly. Not enough to level out, but enough to adjust its descent. Because Yasukawa, half conscious, still had one hand on the stick. Not to survive, but to avoid crashing into the Japanese fleet below. The Hellcat pilots were stunned. He's steering it away from the carriers. He's actually steering it. The last decision. Yasukawa blinked through the wind and smoke. The Shokaku and Zuikaku, or what remained of them, sat miles away, dark shapes trailing black smoke columns. Below him, only open water stretched as far as his fading vision could follow. He would not hit the carriers. He would not drag his burning Zero into the decks where hundreds fought to save their ship. He turned the stick, just a little, enough to shift the angle. The roll eased. The descent slowed. Not much, not enough to survive, but enough to choose where he would fall. He whispered, "Forgive me." He wasn't sure to whom. His mother, his brother, his homeland, his ancestors. The pilots who wouldn't return from this battle. He wasn't dying in glory. He was dying in fire. But he had taken 4 bombers with him, and he had protected the fleet. Impact. The Zero struck the Pacific in a violent spray of steam and flame. The Hellcat pilots circled above, watching as the burning wreck broke apart. Spinning chunks of wing and fuselage swallowed instantly by the churning blue. The flames hissed out. The sea swallowed everything. One pilot removed his oxygen mask and whispered, "I'll wait to die. I'll pilot." They didn't salute, but for a moment, they were silent. And the silence was respect. What the fleet saw. Japanese lookouts aboard the Zuikaku witnessed the final seconds of Yasukawa's fall. Some shouted prayers. Some bowed. Some simply watched in stunned disbelief. To them, the burning Zero had looked like a falling star, a streak of fire trailing across the morning sky. They assumed he had died in vain. They had not yet learned that he had taken 4 bombers with him, not yet understood that the flaming arc across the sky wasn't a defeat, but a shield he held alone. The sea swallowed the last fragments of Yasukawa's burning Zero. But the Battle of the Philippine Sea did not pause for grief. Above the Pacific, contrails wove across the sky like tangled scars, and the thunder of distant explosions rolled across the horizon. Yet down below, aboard the Shokaku, men were gathering on the listing deck, staring toward the patch of ocean where the flaming fighter had disappeared. They had seen pieces of it, just enough to know that someone had gone down fighting, but no one knew who. Not yet. Below decks, emergency klaxons wailed as engineers fought to contain the torpedo damage from earlier strikes. The ship was bleeding, taking water, belching smoke, crawling forward on crippled screws. Yet the crew's focus drifted toward the sky, where an impossible story had just unfolded. A junior signalman pointed toward the rising smoke trails of the downed B-24s. "For bombers fell," he said softly. That could not have been one plane. But an older petty officer beside him shook his head. "I saw it, a Zero on fire. Still flying. Still attacking." Around them, sailors whispered, as if afraid disbelief might break the moment. A ghost. An omen. A warrior from the old stories. No one believed a mortal pilot could keep flying with a wing engulfed in flame. No one believed a damaged Zero could maneuver at all, let alone strike down 4 bombers in succession. Yet, the evidence hung in the sky, for thick, rising columns of smoke, for spiraling trails where bombers had died, for colossal splashes marking their resting places. The truth was undeniable. Someone had done it. The Shokaku's fate. But the Shokaku's survival was not guaranteed. By late morning, American torpedo bombers, successfully breaking through the outer fighter screen, launched a second devastating attack. Hail and smoke control teams worked desperately to keep the ship afloat. But the torpedo wounds were catastrophic. Flooding reached critical compartments. Bulkheads groaned. Electrical fires climbed the ventilation systems. Then came the order no Japanese sailor wanted to hear. Abandon ship. Crewmen scrambled across the deck as the great carrier listed sharply to port. Smoke poured from a ruptured hull. Lifeboats splashed into the ocean. Shouts filled the air as sailors leapt into the water, clinging to debris as the massive ship began her death roll. And as the Shokaku's bow dipped into the sea, a lookout suddenly shouted, "There, a survivor!" All heads turned. A single figure floated on the surface. A pilot's silhouette, bobbing between rolling waves, half conscious, but alive. A pilot still strapped to a wrecked seat cushion. A pilot coughing seawater. A pilot with half his flight suit burned through. A pilot with a shattered flight harness barely holding him afloat. A pilot with the remains of a Zero's canopy frame tangled around his legs. The deck crews stared in disbelief. It can't be. No one could survive that. That Zero exploded in the air. But the pilot remained alive, barely. A whaleboat was lowered. Sailors rowed frantically. Within minutes, they hauled him aboard. And when they rolled him onto the deck of the rescue vessel, someone shouted, "It's Yasukawa. It's Petty Officer Yasukawa." A murmur spread. Shock, relief, awe. The man they thought had died a warrior's death. The man they believed had fallen to protect them was still breathing. His burns were severe. His lungs filled with smoke. He drifted in and out of consciousness. But when he finally forced his swollen eyes open, a single question rasped from his cracked lips. Did the bombers reach the fleet? A stunned silence followed. One sailor knelt beside him. "No," he whispered. "None of them did." Yasukawa closed his eyes, not in pain, not in grief, but in satisfaction. The legend spreads. By evening, the story had spread across the splintering Japanese fleet. Pilots whispered it in ready rooms. Mechanics repeated it with awe on the hangar decks. Officers exchanged glances, unsure whether to believe it, but unable to argue with the wreckage on the sea. A Zero, burning, crippled, mortally wounded, had destroyed 4 American bombers while half on fire, and the pilot had lived, but far away aboard American carriers. A different version of the miracle spread. The Hellcat pilots who witnessed the Flaming Zero's final descent filed their report stunned. He refused to break off. He flew a burning aircraft with more control than any pilot I've seen. He steered away from the fleet. That wasn't kamikaze. That was discipline. No malice, no scorn, no dismissal, just respect, because the sky had shown them something rare. A man who kept fighting long after physics and survival said he shouldn't. The battle ends as night fell. Yasukawa lay in a makeshift infirmary aboard a destroyer escort. Bandages wrapped his arms. His hair was singed to the scalp. He drifted in and out of fevered dreams, flashes of fire, the sound of cannons, the roar of collapsing engines. But one detail stayed with him. The moment when a 4th bomber fell, spiraling into the sea as flames trailed from its engines. He remembered the heat, the fire, the certainty of death, and the stubborn will that kept him in the fight. He had not flown for glory, not for rank, not even for vengeance. He had flown because he believed, in that one moment, that only he stood between disaster and survival. That belief had given him strength no aircraft could. But the final part of his story, the one history would remember, was still waiting. Because Yasukawa's legend would not end with survival. It would end with what he did next. Night settled over the Pacific like a vast, dark curtain, broken only by the faint, rhythmic flashing of signal lamps between scattered Japanese vessels retreating from the devastating battle. The once mighty carrier force was now a fractured skeleton. Burning hulls, crippled ships, drifting survivors clutching debris. The Shokaku was gone. The Haya was gone. What remained of the fleet struggled westward, limping toward safety. Deep inside a cramped destroyer infirmary, Petty Officer First Class Masaru Yasukawa lay wrapped in layers of bandages. Weak, but alive. Each breath rattled in his chest. His right arm was a swollen, blistered mass of raw flesh. His hair was burned nearly to the scalp. His eyes were ringed with soot. Yet the whispers around him were not of pity. They were of reverence. Sailors stepped softly when they approached his cot, as though entering a shrine. Young recruits who had never flown bowed their heads. Hardened petty officers who had survived years of grueling Pacific combat paused in silence. A pilot who had fought while burning, destroyed 4 bombers, and steered himself away from friendly ships to avoid killing his own. Such a thing was not merely bravery, it was myth in the making. Still, Yasukawa didn't want myth. He wanted truth. The report. Near midnight, a grim-faced officer from the surviving carrier staff entered the infirmary. The man knelt beside Yasukawa, carefully removing his cap. Petty Officer Yasukawa, he began quietly. We have completed the battle reports. He glanced around the dimly lit room, then leaned closer. The admirals know what you did. Yasukawa swallowed, throat raw. Was the fleet saved? The officer hesitated only a moment before nodding. Yes, the bombers you destroyed were the last formation with a direct line on our carriers. Without you, they might have crippled the Zuikaku. A faint tremor passed through Yasukawa's face. A tiny sigh of relief, but the officer wasn't finished. However, your actions caused confusion among Western analysts. The Americans believe a full squadron intercepted their bombers. They refuse to accept that one plane, burning, could have downed 4 of their own in rapid succession. Yasukawa let out a rasping breath that might have been a laugh. Then let them believe what they wish. The officer bowed low. Your name will be submitted for commendation, posthumous if necessary. Yasukawa closed his eyes at that, not out of fear, but acceptance. The return to shore. The destroyer reached the anchorage at Okinawa 3 days later. Word of the Burning Zero pilot had already reached the airfields. Mechanics paused at their work. Naval infantry stopped mid-drill. Pilots whispered in mess halls. Some believed the story instantly. Others scoffed, but all wanted to see the man who turned fire into a weapon. Yasukawa was carried ashore on a stretcher, emaciated and heavily bandaged. Yet as the medical crew escorted him past a line of aircraft, a squadron of pilots snapped to attention. Every single one saluted. Yasukawa tried to raise a hand in return, but pain stopped him halfway. A young pilot stepped forward with tears in his eyes. Your courage will guide us, he said quietly. Yasukawa swallowed hard. I only did what was necessary. But the young pilot shook his head. No, he did what no one else could. The final request. 3 days later, Yasukawa regained enough strength to sit up with support. A doctor brought him water. A nurse adjusted his bandages. Another officer entered with a clipboard. Petty officer, the officer said gently. Command wishes to transfer you home to recover. Yasukawa's eyes remained half-lit. No, he whispered. I must return to my unit. The officer frowned. That is impossible. You are in no condition to fly again. Yasukawa's voice hardened. Then I will teach. I will train new pilots. I will help them survive long enough to return home. The officer stared at him for a long moment, processing the meaning beneath the words. Yasukawa was not asking to fight again. He was asking to make sure his death, which had somehow not happened, would mean something. Finally, the officer nodded. You will have that chance. Yasukawa sank back into pillow, breathing shakily. One chapter of his war was over. The next, unexpected, unwanted, but necessary, was beginning. The legend takes shape. Weeks passed. Yasukawa underwent skin grafts, respiratory treatment, long hours of forced rest. But the story of his Burning Zero spread far faster than he healed. They called him the Fire Wing Ace, the Phoenix of the Marianas, the Zero that refused to die. To desperate pilots struggling in an unwinnable war, his story was a spark of impossible hope. If he could survive the sky burning around him, then maybe they had a chance to. American pilots, meanwhile, shared a different version in their ready rooms. Never seen anything like it. That guy didn't fly a plane, he commanded it. If he hadn't died in the crash, I'd shake his hand. Respect given by enemies was a rare thing in war, but Yasukawa had earned it. A quiet moment of truth. One evening, as the sun dipped into the sea, Yasukawa stood, shaking, leaning on a nurse, just outside the infirmary. He watched the sky he once ruled, the same sky that had burned around him, the same sky he had refused to abandon. He whispered, "Why did I survive?" No one answered, but perhaps the sky itself held the answer, because history needed to remember that even in the darkest battles, even on the losing side of a war, courage could burn brighter than fire, and sometimes impossibly, the fire could not stop him. When the war finally ended, the surviving pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy returned home as shadows of their former selves, thin, weary, carrying memories of skies filled with fire. Among them was Masaru Yasukawa, the man whose Burning Zero had torn through 4 American bombers in 3 breathtaking minutes. Official reports recorded his feat, but quietly. The Empire needed symbols, but it also needed myths that didn't defy military logic. An aircraft on fire should not have been able to maneuver, let alone fight. And yet he had done both, with a will that seemed carved from steel. In the years after surrender, Yasukawa moved to a small coastal village in Kyushu. The war had taken most of his squadron, his ship, and nearly his own life. But it never robbed him of discipline or purpose. He taught aviation theory to young mechanics, insisting they learn not only engines and airframes, but responsibility. Power means nothing without control, he would say. Courage means nothing without clarity. But resolve can carry a man farther than fuel. When former American pilots visited Japan during post-war reconciliation tours, one story consistently resurfaced: the Burning Zero that refused to die. Many believed the pilot had been killed. Others doubted he ever survived the crash. But when they met veterans who whispered his name, some traveled to his village to pay respect. One American aviator described the meeting this way: "I shook the hand of the bravest pilot I ever fought." He bowed, and for a moment, the war truly ended for me. Yasukawa never boasted about that day in June 1944. He spoke of his burns. He spoke of the men he trained. He spoke of the friends he lost. But when someone mentioned the 4 bombers, he always lowered his gaze. Another pilot would have done the same, he insisted. But deep down, everyone knew very few men on Earth would have held onto a burning aircraft and used it as a weapon to protect their comrades. His legacy was not the kill count, not the legend, not the miracle of survival. It was this: he refused to let go of the mission, even when the sky itself tried to tear him from it. And decades later, that story still inspires anyone who has ever fought against impossible odds. Pilots, soldiers, civilians, dreamers, and storytellers alike. If this story moved you, do me a favor and hit that like button so more people can discover these forgotten moments of courage. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And if anyone in your family ever served in the air, and if you want more cinematic, long-form war stories like this one, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. There are many more missions waiting to be brought back to life.